The gunshot that rang through the Fargo, Dakota Territory saloon on that sweltering August evening in 1876 changed everything, though not in the way Hannah Owens expected when she instinctively threw herself over the whimpering child cowering beneath the poker table. The bullet had sailed harmlessly into the wooden beam above them, fired by a drunk miner whose aim was as poor as his judgment, but the damage was already done. In her rush to protect the terrified boy, Hannah's carefully maintained gloves had caught on a splintered table leg and torn clean through, exposing the mottled pink and white flesh of her left hand to the smoky lamplight and curious eyes of 24 onlookers. She snatched her hand back immediately, pressing it against her chest as her heart hammered against her ribs. The boy scrambled out from under the table and ran to his father, leaving Hannah crouched on the sawdust-covered floor, feeling the weight of stares like physical touches on her skin. She fumbled with the ruined glove, trying desperately to pull the torn fabric back into place, but it was useless. "You all right, miss?" a deep voice asked from somewhere above her. Hannah kept her head down, her auburn hair falling forward to hide her burning cheeks. "I am fine, thank you." "Does not look fine to me." The voice belonged to a man who now crouched beside her, his worn boots and dusty chaps entering her limited field of vision. "Let me help you up." "I can manage," she said quickly, pushing herself to her feet without assistance. She kept her damaged hand tucked close to her body, hidden behind the folds of her simple brown skirt. But the man rose with her, and she found herself looking into a pair of concerned gray eyes set in a sun-weathered face. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw shadowed with stubble. He wore the practical clothing of a ranch hand, all leather and denim, dusty from a long day's work. "Name's Isaac Dalton," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I work at the Triple J Ranch about 10 miles west of town." Hannah nodded stiffly, already turning away. "If you will excuse me." "Wait." His hand moved as if to catch her elbow but stopped short. "Your glove is torn. My mother, she is real good with a needle. She could probably fix it up for you, or I could take you to the general store. They should still be open for another hour." "That will not be necessary." Hannah's voice came out sharper than she intended. She could feel people still watching, though the saloon had mostly returned to its previous din of conversation and clinking glasses. The drunk miner was being hauled out by two friends, still shouting incoherently about someone cheating at cards. Isaac's gray eyes flickered down to where she clutched her hand against her ribs, then back up to her face. Something in his expression shifted, softened. "All right then. But if you change your mind, the Triple J is an easy ride from town. Anyone can point you in the right direction." Hannah gave him the briefest nod and hurried toward the door, keeping her head down and her ruined hand hidden. The evening air hit her face like a splash of cool water after the stifling heat of the saloon, and she gulped it gratefully as she hurried down the wooden sidewalk toward the boarding house where she rented a small room. Mrs. Henderson, the landlady, was in the kitchen when Hannah slipped through the front door. She made it to her room on the second floor without encountering anyone else, which felt like a small mercy. Once inside with the door firmly locked, she finally allowed herself to look at her exposed hand. The scars were as they had always been since the fire 3 years ago, a landscape of healed burns that stretched from her fingertips to her wrist and continued up her forearm. Her right hand bore similar marks, though not quite as extensive. The doctors in St. Louis had done what they could, and she had been lucky, they told her. Lucky that the burns had not gone deeper, lucky that she had retained full use of her hands, lucky that the scars had not spread to her face or other visible parts of her body. Lucky. She did not feel lucky as she carefully removed both gloves and examined the damage to the left one. The seam along the side had torn completely, and there was a ragged hole near the thumb. It could be repaired, perhaps, but it would take careful work. She only owned 3 pairs of gloves, and she wore them constantly, even in the summer heat, even when it made people give her odd looks. Hannah sat on the edge of her narrow bed and allowed herself a moment of despair. She had been so careful since arriving in Fargo 6 months ago. She had kept to herself, had worn her gloves religiously, had avoided situations where they might be removed. She worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations that she completed in the privacy of her room. It was lonely work, but it was safe. No one asked questions about hands that were always covered when those hands produced such neat, precise stitching. But tonight, in a moment of pure instinct, she had forgotten to be careful. She had seen that child's frightened face and had thought of nothing but getting him to safety. And now Dalton had seen her scars, had looked right at her ruined hand. And even though he had been kind, even though he had not recoiled or made a cruel comment, she could not shake the hot shame that burned in her chest. She spent the evening repairing the torn glove by lamplight, her needle flashing silver as she worked. It was not her best work, but it would hold. Tomorrow she would keep to her room, would decline the few social invitations she occasionally received from the other boarders. She would be more careful, but Fargo was a small town, and news traveled fast. Over the next few days, Hannah noticed the change immediately. Women who had previously greeted her with polite nods now whispered behind their hands as she passed. The general store clerk, who had always been friendly, now looked at her with undisguised curiosity. Someone must have spread the word about what had happened at the saloon, and while no one was overtly cruel, Hannah felt the weight of their speculation and pity like a physical burden. She stopped going out except when absolutely necessary. Mrs. Henderson brought her meals up to her room, and Hannah threw herself into her sewing with renewed intensity, working late into the night until her eyes burned and her fingers cramped around her needle. It was on a Thursday afternoon, nearly a week after the incident at the saloon, when Mrs. Henderson knocked on her door with more than just a dinner tray. "You have a visitor, dear," the older woman said, her round face creased with concern. "A gentleman from one of the ranches. Says he has some mending that needs doing." Hannah's stomach clenched. "Did he give a name?" "Dalton, I believe. Isaac Dalton. He is waiting in the parlor, very polite young man. Shall I send him up, or would you prefer to come down?" "Neither," Hannah said quickly. "Please tell him I am not available." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "Not available? But dear, you take in sewing work. It would be odd to turn away a paying customer." She had a point, and Hannah knew it. She could not afford to turn down work, especially not when she was already barely making enough to cover her room and board. With a resigned sigh, she checked that her gloves were securely in place and followed Mrs. Henderson down the narrow stairs. Isaac Dalton stood in the boarding-house parlor, hat in hand, looking somewhat out of place among the doilies and delicate furniture. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and his weathered face broke into a smile that transformed his rather stern features. "Miss Owens," he said. "I apologize for calling on you without notice. Mr. Dalton." Hannah remained in the doorway, keeping a careful distance between them. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you have some mending." "I do." He reached into a canvas bag at his feet and pulled out several shirts, all well worn and in need of repair. "My mother usually handles this sort of thing, but she has been feeling poorly lately, arthritis in her hands. I heard you do excellent work." Hannah eyed him suspiciously. It seemed too convenient, this appearance at her door with a bag full of mending, barely a week after their encounter at the saloon. I am sure there are other seamstresses in Fargo. There are, he agreed easily. But I was told you are the best. Who told you that? Mrs. Chen at the laundry. And Mr. Peterson at the general store. And actually, about half a dozen other people when I started asking around. He set the shirts on the small table near the window. I will pay fair wages, of course, whatever your usual rate is. Hannah wanted to refuse, wanted to send him away, but she found herself moving closer to examine the shirts instead. They were of good quality fabric, worn soft from use but not beyond saving. The tiers and frayed cuffs would require careful work, but nothing too challenging. I could have these ready in 3 days. That would be perfect. Isaac reached into his pocket and pulled out several bills, more than enough to cover the work. Will this be sufficient? It was actually more than she would have charged, but Hannah was not in a position to argue. She nodded and took the money carefully, making sure her gloved hands did not brush against his. Isaac did not leave immediately. Instead, he stood there turning his hat in his hands, as if working up the courage to say something. Hannah waited, her spine straight, her chin lifted in unconscious defiance. "Miss Owens," he finally said, "I want you to know that what I saw the other night, it does not change my opinion of you. You were brave, throwing yourself over that child like you did. That is what I will remember." Hannah's throat tightened. She had not expected kindness, and it disarmed her more thoroughly than cruelty would have. "Thank you," she managed. "That will be all, Mr. Dalton." He took the dismissal with good grace, settling his hat back on his head and nodding politely before taking his leave. Hannah stood in the parlor long after he had gone, holding his shirts and wondering why her eyes were stinging with unshed tears. She threw herself into the mending with the same intensity she brought to all her work. The shirts were repaired with tiny, almost invisible stitches, the frayed cuffs reinforced, even a missing button replaced with one she found in her sewing box that matched closely enough. It was some of her finest work, and she told herself it was professional pride that drove her, nothing more. Isaac returned exactly 3 days later to collect his shirts. This time Hannah met him in the parlor without having to be summoned, the mended clothing wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "That was fast," he said, accepting the package. "Thank you." "It was straightforward work," Hannah replied, keeping her tone professional and distant. Isaac unwrapped one of the shirts and examined it in the afternoon light streaming through the parlor window. His eyebrows rose appreciably. "This is incredible. I can barely see where the tear was." He looked up at her with genuine admiration. "You really are the best." Despite herself, Hannah felt a flush of pleasure at the praise. "I do my best. My mother is going to be impressed. She takes pride in her mending, but even she could not do work this fine anymore." He refolded the shirt carefully. "Actually, I was wondering if you might consider coming out to the ranch sometime. My mother has been feeling isolated, with her arthritis making it hard to do the handwork she used to enjoy. I think she would appreciate meeting someone who shares her interest in sewing." "I do not make social calls," Hannah said quickly. "It would not have to be social. You could call it a business consultation." Isaac's gray eyes were earnest. "My mother has a whole trunk full of fabric and notions she cannot use anymore. I am sure she would be happy to sell some of it to you, probably for less than you would pay at the general store." Hannah hesitated. She was running low on thread, and good fabric was expensive. But going to the ranch meant being around people, meant risking more situations where her careful control might slip. "I appreciate the offer, but I do not think it would be appropriate." "Why not?" The question was direct but not aggressive. "I barely know you, Mr. Dalton. It would not be proper for me to visit your home. My mother will be there the whole time, along with our housekeeper, Mrs. Garcia. It would be perfectly respectable." He paused, then added gently, "Unless you are worried about something else." Hannah's hands clenched at her sides. "I am simply not interested in social situations, Mr. Dalton. Surely you can understand that." "I can," he said quietly. "But I do not think you should have to hide away because of what happened in that saloon. People talk, sure, but they will talk regardless. Living your life despite them, that is the only real answer." "Easy for you to say," Hannah shot back before she could stop herself. "You do not have to deal with the stares and the whispers." "You are right," Isaac acknowledged. "I do not. But I have seen what happens when good people let fear make them small. My sister went through something similar, different circumstances, but the same result. She stopped going to town, stopped seeing friends, just disappeared into herself. It took years before she found her way back out." His expression was earnest, almost pleading. "I just hate to see someone else going down that same road." Hannah wanted to be angry at his presumption, at the way he seemed to think he understood her situation, but the genuine concern in his voice deflated her indignation. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Dalton, but I am managing just fine." "I am sure you are," he said, "but the offer stands whenever you are ready. The Triple J Ranch, 10 miles west. Anyone in town can give you directions." After he left, Hannah sat in the parlor for a long time, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight. Mrs. Henderson found her there an hour later, still holding the money Isaac had paid for the mending. "He seems like a good man," the landlady said gently. "Not many young men would be so thoughtful. He pities me," Hannah said flatly. "I do not think that is what I saw." Mrs. Henderson settled into her favorite chair with a soft grunt. "Pity has a different look to it, dear. That young man looked at you like he was trying to solve a puzzle, like he was genuinely interested in understanding you." "That is somehow worse," Hannah muttered. Mrs. Henderson laughed, a warm sound that filled the small parlor. "Understanding is worse than pity." "My dear girl, you have been alone too long if you believe that." Maybe she was right. Hannah had been alone for 3 years now, ever since the fire that had destroyed her family's bakery in St. Louis and taken her parents with it. She had been 21 years old, an only child, suddenly orphaned and scarred and adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for someone like her. She had spent 6 months recovering, living on the charity of neighbors who were kind but clearly relieved, when she finally announced her intention to move west. The frontier was supposed to be a place where people could reinvent themselves, where the past did not matter as much as what you could contribute. Hannah had chosen Fargo almost at random, drawn by a newspaper advertisement seeking skilled workers in the growing Dakota Territory town. For 6 months, it had worked. She had kept to herself, had built a small but steady business doing alterations and mending, had created a quiet life that felt safe even if it was lonely. But the incident at the saloon had shattered that carefully constructed security, and now she did not know how to proceed. The days passed, bleeding into weeks. Hannah continued her work, continued her self-imposed isolation, but she found her thoughts returning again and again to Isaac Dalton's words. She thought about his sister, about the years lost to fear and shame. She thought about the way he had looked at her with concern but not pity, with interest but not morbid curiosity. She thought about his invitation. It was late September when she finally made her decision. The heat of summer had broken, and the Dakota Territory air carried the first hints of autumn chill. Hannah wrapped herself in a shawl, checked that her gloves were secure, and walked to the livery stable where she arranged to rent a horse and buggy for the day. The clerk, a weathered man named Murphy who had always been friendly, looked surprised to see her. "Going somewhere, Miss Owens?" "The Triple J Ranch," she said, trying to sound confident. I understand it is about 10 miles west. That's right. Easy road to follow, too. Just stay on the main path and you cannot miss it. He helped her into the buggy, his calloused hand steadying the horse. Fine day for a drive. You picked good weather for it. The ride out of town was both terrifying and exhilarating. Hannah had not been on a horse or driven a buggy in years, not since before the fire, but the skills came back to her gradually. The landscape opened up around her, endless rolling prairie, punctuated by occasional stands of cottonwood trees. The sky was enormous, a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds, and the air smelled of grass and earth and freedom. She passed several other ranches before spotting the sign for the Triple J. The main house was a sprawling structure of wood and stone, clearly built in stages as the ranch grew. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including a large barn, a stable, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and she could see several men on horseback working with the herd. Hannah almost turned the buggy around 3 times before she finally steered it up the long drive to the main house. Before she could lose her nerve entirely, the front door opened and Isaac Dalton emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Miss Owens," he called, his surprise evident. "I did not expect to see you." "You invited me," Hannah said, her voice wavering only slightly. "I am here about the fabric your mother wished to sell." Isaac's face broke into that transforming smile. "Of course. Please come in. My mother will be thrilled." He helped her down from the buggy, his hands careful and respectful, never lingering longer than necessary. Hannah was grateful for that consideration, for the way he seemed to understand without being told that she did not like to be touched. The inside of the house was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of baking bread and wood smoke. Isaac led her through a comfortable sitting room to a sunlit parlor where an older woman sat in a rocking chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Mother, this is Miss Hannah Owens, the seamstress I told you about. Miss Owens, my mother, Margaret Dalton." Margaret Dalton was perhaps 55, with gray streaked through her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis, the knuckles swollen and the fingers slightly twisted. She looked up at Hannah with bright, intelligent eyes. "Miss Owens, what a pleasure. Isaac has told me so much about your beautiful work." She gestured to a chair near her own. "Please sit down." "Isaac, ask Mrs. Garcia to bring tea." Hannah found herself settled in the parlor, a cup of tea balanced on her gloved hands, listening as Margaret Dalton talked about her love of sewing and the frustration of no longer being able to indulge in it as she once had. "The worst part is not the pain," Margaret said, holding up her twisted hands. "It is the loss of being able to create something beautiful. I have all these ideas, all these patterns and fabrics, and I cannot bring them to life anymore." "That must be very difficult," Hannah said softly, and she meant it. She could not imagine losing the ability to sew, to work with fabric and thread and watch something beautiful take shape beneath her fingers. "It is," Margaret agreed, "but Isaac tells me you are wonderfully talented. Perhaps you would consider taking on some commission work. I would pay well, and I have more fabric than I know what to do with." They spent the next hour discussing patterns and projects, with Margaret pulling out sketches and fabric samples from an enormous trunk in the corner of the parlor. Hannah found herself relaxing despite her initial nervousness, drawn in by Margaret's enthusiasm and genuine love of the craft. It was not until Isaac returned with fresh tea that Hannah realized how much time had passed. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows at a different angle, and she suddenly felt guilty for taking up so much of their time. "I should go," she said, starting to rise. "I have taken up enough of your afternoon." "Nonsense," Margaret said. "You must stay for dinner. Mrs. Garcia always makes far too much food, and Isaac would be happy for the company of someone other than his aging mother. I am hardly company, Hannah protested, but her objection was weak. In the end, she stayed. Dinner was a lively affair, with Isaac and his mother trading easy banter while Mrs. Garcia, a plump woman with kind eyes, brought out dish after dish of delicious food. Hannah found herself laughing at Isaac's stories about ranch life, about ornery cattle and horses with personalities, and the constant challenge of keeping everything running smoothly. "Your father would be proud," Margaret said at one point, her voice suddenly soft. "You have done so well with this place, Isaac." "We have done well," Isaac corrected gently. "I could not have managed without you handling the books and the contracts." It was clear they were a close family, bound by love and mutual respect. Hannah felt a pang of loss, remembering her own parents, the warmth of their bakery, the way her mother would hum while kneading dough and her father would tell terrible jokes that made customers groan but smile anyway. After dinner, Isaac insisted on driving her back to town in his own wagon with her rented buggy tied behind. "It will be dark soon," he said when she tried to protest. "The road can be tricky at night if you are not familiar with it." The ride back was quieter, both of them comfortable with the silence. The first stars were appearing overhead, and the prairie stretched out around them like a dark ocean. Hannah found herself studying Isaac's profile in the gathering dusk, the strong line of his jaw, the competent way he handled the reins. "Thank you," she said finally, "for inviting me. Your mother is lovely." "She liked you too," Isaac said. "She told me while you were getting your shawl that you were exactly the sort of person she had been hoping to meet." "I cannot imagine why," Hannah said before she could stop herself. "I am not exactly good company." Isaac was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You know, when I first saw you in that saloon, throwing yourself over that child without a thought for your own safety, I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met. And then when your glove tore and I saw the scars, I thought you were even braver, because I realized you had probably been through something terrible, and you were still out there living your life, still protecting others." Hannah's throat tightened. "I am not brave, Mr. Dalton. I am a coward who hides in her room and wears gloves even in summer." "Surviving takes courage," Isaac said quietly. "You are still here. You are still creating beautiful things with your hands. That is not cowardice." They arrived back at the boarding house too soon and not soon enough. Isaac helped her down from the wagon, then untied her rented buggy and handed her the reins. "I hope you will come back to the ranch," he said. "My mother really would like to commission some work from you, and I think she would enjoy the company." "I will consider it," Hannah said, and she meant it. Over the following weeks, Hannah found herself making the trip to the Triple J Ranch with increasing frequency. Margaret had indeed commissioned several projects, beautiful dresses and quilts and curtains that challenged Hannah's skills and reignited her passion for the craft. But more than that, she found herself looking forward to the conversations with Margaret, to the way Isaac would join them for lunch and tell stories that made them both laugh, to the sense of belonging that slowly began to seep into the lonely places in her heart. It was during one of these visits, in mid-October with autumn painting the prairie in shades of gold and rust, that everything changed. Hannah had been working in the parlor, pinning a complex dress pattern, when she felt the beginning of a sneeze. She turned away quickly, but the sudden movement caused her to knock over her pin box, sending dozens of pins scattering across the hardwood floor. "Oh no," she muttered, dropping to her knees to gather them up before someone stepped on one. Isaac, who had been reading a letter in the corner, immediately set it aside and joined her on the floor. "Let me help." "It is fine, I can manage," Hannah said, but he was already picking up pins, dropping them carefully back into the box. They worked in silence for a moment, heads bent close together as they searched for the tiny pins. Hannah had just spotted one under the edge of the settee when she felt the seam of her right glove split. The fabric was old, weakened by constant wear and washing, and it chose that moment to finally give way completely. Before she could pull her hand back, Isaac had seen it. His gray eyes dropped to the mottled scars covering her hand and wrist, the evidence of the fire that had changed her life written permanently on her skin. Hannah snatched her hand away, clutching it to her chest, her face burning with shame. "I should go," she said quickly, starting to rise. "Wait." Isaac's hand moved to stop her but stopped short of actually touching her. "Please wait. I need to leave." Hannah's voice was shaking now. "I will finish the dress at home and bring it back next week." Hannah. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in his tone made her freeze. "Please do not run away." "I am not running," she said, but they both knew it was a lie. Isaac sat back on his heels, his expression serious. "I am going to say something, and I need you to hear me." "Really hear me? Can you do that?" Hannah wanted to flee, wanted to gather up her things and race back to the safety of her boarding house room, but something in Isaac's eyes held her in place. She nodded, barely, her ruined hand still pressed against her chest. "I do not care about your scars," Isaac said clearly. "I know you think I should. I know you think they make you somehow less worthy of attention or kindness, or," he paused, took a breath, "or affection. But they do not. They are just part of your story, part of what you survived." "You do not understand," Hannah whispered. "You do not know what it is like to have people look at you with pity or disgust, to see children stare and adults whisper." "You are right. I do not understand that specific experience," Isaac agreed. "But I understand what it is like to let fear make your world smaller. I told you about my sister, but I did not tell you everything. She was caught in a stampede when she was 17. A bull hooked her leg, tore it up badly. She walks with a limp now, always will. And for 2 years she barely left her room. She was convinced no one would ever see past that limp, that she was ruined, unmarriageable, worthless." "What happened to her?" Hannah asked despite herself. She met a man who did not care about her limp, who saw her intelligence and her humor and her kindness, and those were the things that mattered to him. They have been married 5 years now, live in Montana with 2 children, and she is happy. Isaac's gray eyes were intense, locked on Hannah's face. She is happy because she finally believed what he had been telling her all along, that she was so much more than a damaged leg. "That is different," Hannah protested weakly. "How?" The question was direct, challenging. "I do not know, it just is." Hannah heard how childish that sounded even as the words left her mouth. Isaac shifted closer, still not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Can I see your hand? Really see it in the light?" Every instinct screamed at Hannah to refuse, to pull further away, to run. But something in Isaac's face, something earnest and open and without a trace of pity, made her slowly, so slowly, extend her right hand toward him. Isaac did not grab for it. Instead, he held up both his own hands, palms up, an offering rather than a demand. Hannah understood the gesture, appreciated it more than she could say. She placed her scarred hand in his, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. He looked at her hand for a long moment, his calloused thumb carefully tracing the line where scarred tissue met unmarred skin. Then, with movements so gentle they made Hannah's breath catch, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, right over the worst of the scarring. "Beautiful," he said softly, his gray eyes rising to meet hers. "You are beautiful, Hannah Owens. Every part of you." Hannah felt something crack open in her chest, some tightly held knot of shame and fear that had been choking her for 3 years. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. And then Isaac was gathering her carefully into his arms, holding her while she cried against his shoulder. 3 years of grief and loneliness and self-hatred pouring out of her all at once. When the storm finally passed, Hannah found herself sitting on the floor of Margaret Dalton's parlor, her head resting against Isaac's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. She should have felt embarrassed, should have pulled away and apologized, but instead she felt strangely peaceful, lighter than she had been in years. "I am sorry," she said finally, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Do not be." Isaac's voice rumbled in his chest, and Hannah could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong beneath her ear. "You needed that. I got your shirt all wet. I have others." She could hear the smile in his voice. "You can mend this one for me." That surprised a watery laugh out of her. "Are you trying to drum up more business? Maybe I am just trying to ensure you have reasons to keep coming back here." Isaac's arms tightened slightly around her. "I've gotten rather used to seeing you around the ranch." Hannah finally pulled back enough to look up at his face. His eyes were soft, his expression tender, and there was something in the way he looked at her that made her heart skip. "Mr. Dalton, Isaac," he corrected gently. "I think we are past formalities at this point." "Isaac," she amended, the name feeling strange and right on her tongue. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I care about you," Isaac said simply. "I have cared about you since that night in the saloon when you threw yourself over a stranger's child without hesitation. I admire your courage, your skill, your kindness. And I would very much like to court you properly if you would allow it." "Court me," Hannah repeated, stunned. "But I am scarred, damaged. Stop." Isaac's voice was firm but not unkind. "You are not damaged. You are a person who has been through something terrible and survived. Those are two very different things." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch achingly gentle. "I see you, Hannah, not your scars, not your fear, but you, and what I see is wonderful." Hannah closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, letting herself feel it fully for perhaps the first time in 3 years. "I do not know if I can believe that." "Then let me believe it for you until you are ready to believe it yourself," Isaac said. "Give me a chance. Give us a chance." When Hannah opened her eyes again, Isaac was looking at her with such open hope and affection that it took her breath away. And for the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to imagine a future that was not defined by loneliness and hiding, but by this man's steady presence and gentle understanding. "All right," she whispered. "Yes." Isaac's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Thank you." They stayed there on the parlor floor for a while longer, talking quietly until Margaret appeared in the doorway and took in the scene with knowing eyes. "I suppose this means you will be staying for dinner again, Miss Owens?" the older woman asked, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes twinkling. "I think so," Hannah said, feeling her cheeks heat. "If that is all right." "More than all right, dear. More than all right." The courtship that followed was unlike anything Hannah had imagined for herself. Isaac was patient and thoughtful, never pushing her faster than she was comfortable going, always mindful of her need for space and time to adjust. He took her on picnics in the prairie, where they could be alone without the prying eyes of town gossips. He brought her wildflowers that he picked himself, awkwardly arranged but charming in their sincerity. He sat with her in the parlor while she sewed, reading aloud from newspapers and dime novels, his deep voice a comforting backdrop to her work. And slowly, gradually, Hannah began to remove her gloves around him. First just one hand, then both. until eventually she wore them only when they went into town together. It was a liberation she had not known she needed, the simple freedom of letting him see all of her without shame or fear. The town gossips had a field day when word got out that Isaac Dalton was courting the reclusive seamstress. Hannah heard the whispers, saw the looks of surprise and speculation, but somehow they hurt less with Isaac's solid presence beside her. He never seemed embarrassed to be seen with her, never tried to hide her away or make excuses for her scars. Instead, he was openly proud, introducing her to everyone they met as his sweetheart, his hand firm and warm against the small of her back. It was December, with the first real snow of winter dusting the prairie white, when Isaac asked her to marry him. They were in the ranch house parlor, Hannah working on a quilt while Isaac pretended to read but mostly just watched her work. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, and the smell of Mrs. Garcia's cooking wafted from the kitchen. "Hannah," Isaac said suddenly, setting aside his book, "I have something I want to ask you." She looked up from her stitching, immediately alert to the nervous energy radiating from him. "What is it?" Isaac stood and crossed to where she sat, then did something that surprised her. He got down on one knee beside her chair. "I know we have only been courting for a few months, and I know there are people who would say we should wait longer. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single small diamond. "Hannah Owens, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Hannah's hand stilled on her quilt, her heart racing. Marriage. She had thought she would never marry, never have the life she had once dreamed of as a girl. And yet here was Isaac, looking at her with such love and hope, offering her exactly that. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Yes, Isaac, I will marry you." The joy that lit up his face was worth every moment of fear and uncertainty she had endured. He slipped the ring onto her finger, right over the scarred skin, and it fit perfectly. Then he was pulling her into his arms, kissing her properly for the first time, his lips warm and gentle against hers. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Hannah whispered back, and realized with wonder that it was true. Somewhere along the way, between his patient courtship and his steadfast acceptance, she had fallen completely in love with Isaac Dalton. They were married in February 1877, in a small ceremony at the ranch with only close friends and family present. Hannah wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. She did not wear gloves, even though her hands were clearly visible as she and Isaac exchanged vows. Margaret cried openly, as did Mrs. Garcia, and even Murphy from the livery stable looked suspiciously misty-eyed. The wedding night was tender and careful, with Isaac taking his time to show Hannah just how beautiful he found every part of her. He kissed each of her scars, from the tips of her fingers to where they disappeared at her elbows, whispering words of love and devotion until Hannah believed them, really believed them, down to the core of her being. "You are mine now," Isaac said, cradling her face in his hands. "My wife, my love, my partner in everything. Do you understand that?" "I am beginning to," Hannah said, and kissed him again. Married life suited them both. Hannah moved into the ranch house, turning one of the unused rooms into a proper sewing room where she could work on her commissions. She continued to take in sewing work, but now it was a choice rather than a necessity. Something she did because she loved it rather than because she had to survive. Margaret's health improved somewhat with the excitement of having a daughter-in-law, and the three of them formed a comfortable household. Mrs. Garcia ruled the kitchen with benevolent authority, and Hannah learned to cook hearty ranch meals that kept Isaac and the ranch hands well fed. Hannah also began to venture into town more frequently, and while there were still whispers and stares, they bothered her less and less. She had Isaac's love, Margaret's friendship, and her own growing confidence to armor her against unkindness. She even joined the church ladies' sewing circle, where her skills quickly made her a valued member. The turning point came one day in late spring, nearly a year after she had first arrived at the Triple J Ranch. Hannah was in the general store buying thread when she overheard two women talking in the next aisle. "I do not understand what Isaac Dalton sees in her," one woman said. "She is pleasant enough, I suppose, but those hands—" "Hush, Sarah," the other woman interrupted. "That is unkind. I am just saying what everyone thinks. He could have married any girl in town, and he chose the scarred seamstress." Before Hannah could decide whether to confront them or slip away, another voice joined the conversation. "Isaac Dalton chose a woman who is brave and skilled and kind," said Mrs. Chen from the laundry. "He chose a woman who threw herself over a frightened child to protect him from harm. He chose a woman who has overcome tragedy and built a good life for herself. And if you cannot see the value in that, Sarah Whitmore, then you are a foolish woman indeed." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes, but these were good tears, grateful tears. She finished her shopping and thanked Mrs. Chen on her way out, and the older woman simply patted her arm and smiled. When she got home and told Isaac about the incident, he pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "People will always talk," he said, "but they do not matter. What matters is you and me, our life together, the family we are building." "Family?" Hannah pulled back to look at him, her heart suddenly racing. Isaac's smile was soft, hopeful. "I would like that when you are ready. Children, I mean. A house full of laughter and chaos and love." Hannah thought about it, about children with Isaac's gray eyes and his steady nature, about teaching them to sew or ride or whatever else they wanted to learn, about a future that was full instead of empty, bright instead of shadowed by fear. "I would like that too," she said. Their first child, a son they named Henry, was born in the spring of 1878. He was healthy and loud and perfect, with Isaac's dark hair and Hannah's green eyes. Margaret doted on her grandson shamelessly, and Mrs. Garcia spoiled him with treats and toys. Hannah found motherhood both terrifying and wonderful. She worried constantly that her scarred hands would somehow hurt her baby's soft skin, but Isaac assured her over and over that she was the most gentle, careful mother Henry could have asked for. And gradually, as she grew more confident, she relaxed into the role, finding joy in the simple acts of caring for her son. When Henry was old enough to be curious about things, he reached for Hannah's hands one day and traced the scars with tiny, gentle fingers. "What happened?" he asked in his small voice. Hannah looked at Isaac, who nodded encouragingly, and then she told her son about the fire. She kept it simple, appropriate for his age, but she did not hide the truth. "I was hurt," she said, "but I got better, and now I am here with you and your papa. Does it hurt?" Henry asked, his small face creased with concern. "Not anymore," Hannah assured him. "And do you know what? These hands are the same ones that made your favorite blanket and your papa's shirts and all the good things I create. They are strong and capable, and I am proud of them." "I am proud of them too," Henry declared. And then he kissed her scarred knuckles exactly the way he had seen his father do 100 times. Hannah looked over his small head at Isaac, who was watching them with such love in his eyes that it made her breath catch. This was her life now. This was her family. And it was more than she had ever dreamed possible during those dark days in St. Louis. They had 2 more children over the next few years, a daughter named Rose in 1880 and another son named Daniel in 1882. The ranch house was filled with noise and laughter and the controlled chaos that came with 3 young children. Hannah sewed constantly, making clothes and toys and curtains, her scarred hands as nimble as ever. Margaret lived long enough to see all three of her grandchildren, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1883. It was a loss that hit the whole family hard, but there was comfort in knowing she had been happy, surrounded by the family she loved until the very end. As the years passed, Hannah's scars faded somewhat, becoming silver-white instead of angry pink. But more than that, they ceased to define her in her own mind. She was a wife, a mother, a seamstress, a valued member of her community. The scars were simply a part of her history, no more important than the color of her hair or the shape of her nose. She never forgot the fear and shame that had once ruled her life, but those feelings belonged to a different Hannah, a younger woman who had not yet learned what she was capable of surviving. The Hannah she had become was stronger, more confident, more willing to take up space in the world. Isaac, true to his word from that first day in the parlor, never stopped telling her she was beautiful. He kissed her scarred hands every night before they went to sleep, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. And Hannah, who had once thought herself unworthy of love or affection, learned to accept his devotion as the gift it was, to believe that she truly was as wonderful as he insisted she was. In 1885, when Hannah was 30 years old and Isaac was 33, they celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary with a party at the ranch. The house was full of friends and neighbors, including many of the people who had once whispered about the scarred seamstress and the cowboy who loved her. Hannah moved through the crowd with easy grace, her bare hands carrying plates of food and refilling drinks, no longer self-conscious about the scars that marked her skin. At one point, she found herself standing on the porch, looking out over the prairie that had become her home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and she could hear the sounds of laughter and music drifting from inside the house. Isaac came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Dalton." Hannah leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid strength of him against her side. "I was just thinking about how different my life is from what I once imagined it would be." "Better or worse?" Isaac asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "So much better," Hannah said honestly. "I never thought I could be this happy, Isaac. I never thought I deserved it." "Everyone deserves happiness," Isaac said firmly, "but I am glad you found yours with me. I am too." Hannah turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her scarred hands. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." "Thank you for letting me in," Isaac replied. He caught one of her hands and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles in that familiar gesture that never failed to make her heart skip. "Beautiful," he whispered, as he had done 1,000 times before. "You are so beautiful." And finally, after all these years, Hannah believed him. Their children grew up strong and healthy, each with their own personalities and dreams. Henry showed an aptitude for ranching and eagerly learned everything his father could teach him. Rose inherited her mother's love of sewing and her father's business sense, and often talked about opening a dress shop in Fargo when she was older. Daniel was the dreamer, always with his nose in a book, talking about becoming a teacher or maybe even a lawyer. Hannah encouraged all of them, sharing her own story when they were old enough to understand it fully. She wanted them to know that difficult things could be survived, that scars, whether visible or invisible, did not have to define a person's future. In 1888, when Rose was 8 years old, she came home from school in tears. Hannah found her in her room, curled up on her bed, sobbing into her pillow. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Hannah asked, settling onto the bed beside her daughter. "Amy Sullivan said I was strange," Rose hiccuped. She said my mother has ugly hands and it is embarrassing. Hannah felt a familiar flash of pain, but it was distant now, muted by years of healing and love. She waited until Rose's sobs quieted, then gently turned her daughter to face her. "Let me tell you something I learned," Hannah said softly. "There will always be people like Amy Sullivan in the world, people who cannot see past the surface of things. But they are not the people who matter. The people who matter, the people who truly see you, they will look deeper." "But your hands are not ugly," Rose said fiercely. "They make beautiful things. They make my dresses and Papa's shirts, and they hold me when I am sad." Hannah's heart swelled with love for her fierce daughter. "That is exactly right, sweetheart. My hands tell a story about surviving something hard, but more importantly, they tell a story about what I have done since then, about the life I have built and the family I love and the work I create. That is what makes them beautiful." "I think they are beautiful too," Rose said, reaching out to trace the familiar scars. "And I do not care what Amy Sullivan thinks." "That is my girl," Hannah said, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. That evening, she told Isaac about the incident, and he immediately wanted to march over to the Sullivan house and give them a piece of his mind. Hannah talked him out of it, but she loved him for the impulse, for the way he was still, after all these years, ready to defend her honor at a moment's notice. "She is going to be fine," Hannah assured him. "She is strong, our Rose. She knows what matters and what does not." "She learned that from you," Isaac said, pulling Hannah into his arms. "You are the strongest person I know." "I am not sure about that," Hannah demurred, but Isaac stopped her with a kiss. "I am," he said firmly, "and I am going to keep telling you until you believe it." "You may have to tell me for a very long time," Hannah teased. "Good thing I am planning to spend the rest of my life with you then." As the years continued to pass, the Triple J Ranch prospered. Isaac's careful management and hard work paid off, and they were able to expand their operations, buying more land and hiring more hands. Hannah's sewing business also grew, and she eventually hired 2 assistants to help with the volume of work that came in. In 1890, Henry married a sweet girl named Lily from a neighboring ranch, and they started their own family shortly after. Hannah became a grandmother for the first time at the age of 35, holding her tiny granddaughter and marveling at the continuation of the family she had helped create. Rose did indeed open a dress shop in Fargo when she was 20, and it quickly became the most popular establishment of its kind in town. She married a banker named Thomas in 1895, and they built a life together in town while remaining close to the family. Daniel, true to his dreams, went east to university and became a teacher, eventually returning to Dakota Territory to teach at a school in Bismarck. He married a fellow teacher, a bright woman named Sarah, and they filled their home with books and laughter and spirited debates about education and politics. Through it all, Hannah and Isaac remained the center of their growing family, the solid foundation upon which everyone else built their lives. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, mourned losses and celebrated victories, always together, always united. In 1897, 20 years after their wedding, Isaac and Hannah took a trip back to St. Louis. It was Hannah's first time returning to the city since she had left it after the fire, and she was nervous about what she might find. The old neighborhood where her parents' bakery had stood was completely changed. New buildings had risen where the old ones had burned, and there was no trace of the fire that had changed her life. But that was all right, Hannah realized. The past was past, and while it had shaped her, it no longer defined her. They visited the cemetery where her parents were buried, and Hannah laid flowers on their graves. "I am happy," she told them, her voice soft. "I want you to know that." I found love and built a family, and I think you would have been proud of the life I created." Isaac stood behind her, his hands warm on her shoulders, his presence a constant comfort. "They would be proud," he agreed. "How could they not be?" On the train ride back to Dakota Territory, Hannah found herself thinking about the woman she had been when she first arrived in Fargo all those years ago. That frightened, scarred girl who thought her life was over before it had truly begun. If she could go back and tell that girl what the future held, would she believe it? "What are you thinking about?" Isaac asked, his gray eyes, now lined with the weathering of age but still warm and loving, studying her face. "About how grateful I am," Hannah said honestly. "For you, for our family, for this life we have built together, for the fact that you saw past my scars to the person underneath." "I never had to see past anything," Isaac said, taking her scarred hand in his and bringing it to his lips in that familiar gesture. "Your scars were always just a part of you, no more important than any other part. I fell in love with all of you, Hannah. Every single piece." "I know," Hannah said, and she did. After 20 years of marriage, after countless times of him showing her through words and actions how much he loved her, she finally, truly believed it in every fiber of her being. As they pulled into the Fargo station and saw their family waiting on the platform, Henry with his wife and children, Rose with her husband, Daniel, having made the trip from Bismarck, Hannah felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. This was her life. These were her people. And she had been brave enough to reach for this happiness even when she thought she did not deserve it. Isaac helped her down from the train, and they were immediately surrounded by their children and grandchildren, everyone talking at once, eager to hear about their trip. Hannah looked around at all the faces she loved, felt Isaac's arm solid around her waist, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. That night, back in their bedroom at the ranch, Isaac and Hannah got ready for bed with the comfortable ease of a long married couple. Hannah was brushing out her hair, now threaded with some silver, when Isaac came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You remember the first time I kissed your hands?" he asked softly. "In your mother's parlor," Hannah said immediately. "When my glove had torn and I was trying to hide." "I meant every word I said that day," Isaac told her. "You were beautiful then, and you are beautiful now, and you will be beautiful when we are both old and gray." "We are already old and gray," Hannah teased, reaching up to touch the silver at his temples. "Speak for yourself," Isaac retorted, but he was smiling. "I am in my prime." Hannah laughed and turned in his arms to face him properly. "Thank you," she said seriously. "For loving me, for believing in me, for giving me the courage to live a full life instead of hiding away." "Thank you for letting me," Isaac replied, cupping her face in his calloused hands. "For taking a chance on a dusty cowboy who fell in love with you the moment he saw you protecting a child in a saloon." "Best decision I ever made," Hannah whispered, and kissed him. They made love that night with the tenderness and passion of partners who knew each other intimately, who had weathered storms together and come out stronger on the other side. And afterward, lying in Isaac's arms in the darkness, listening to his steady breathing, Hannah thought about how far she had come from that terrified girl in the St. Louis hospital, convinced her life was over. She had been wrong. Her life had not ended with the fire. It had simply been waiting for her to be brave enough to reach for it, to accept the love that was offered, to believe that she was worthy of happiness and belonging. Years continued to pass in a comfortable rhythm. More grandchildren were born, and then great-grandchildren. The Triple J Ranch remained prosperous, eventually passing into Henry's capable hands when Isaac decided to semi-retire in 1905. Hannah and Isaac moved into a smaller house on the property, just big enough for the two of them, though their doors were always open to family. Hannah continued to sew, though her hands were not quite as nimble as they once were. Her scarred tissue had stiffened with age, and arthritis had set in, an ironic echo of Margaret's old affliction. But she still made quilts for new babies and wedding dresses for granddaughters, pouring love into every stitch. Isaac's hair had gone completely white, and his face was deeply lined from years of working in the sun. But Hannah still thought he was the handsomest man she had ever seen. And he still, without fail, kissed her scarred hands every single night and told her she was beautiful. In 1910, on a crisp October evening not unlike the one when Isaac had first kissed her hands so many years ago, they sat together on the porch of their little house, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. They were both in their 50s now, Isaac 59 and Hannah 55, still healthy but feeling the weight of years. "You have any regrets?" Isaac asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Hannah considered the question carefully. "I regret the fire," she said finally. "I regret losing my parents and the pain I went through, but I do not regret anything that came after. How could I when it led me here?" "No regrets then," Isaac agreed, "just gratitude." "So much gratitude," Hannah echoed. They sat there as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their laughter carried on the evening breeze. The ranch that had become her home spread out before them, solid and enduring. Hannah reached for Isaac's hand, lacing her scarred fingers with his weathered ones. He squeezed gently, and she felt the familiar rush of love and contentment that he had brought into her life all those years ago. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too," Isaac replied. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that." And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Hannah Dalton, formerly Hannah Owens, the scarred seamstress who had once thought herself unworthy of love, smiled and held tight to her husband's hand, grateful beyond measure for the beautiful life they had built together. The years that followed were golden ones, filled with the simple pleasures of a life well lived. Hannah and Isaac watched their family continue to grow and prosper, took joy in the small moments, the morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, the evening walks around the property, the way Isaac still opened doors for her after decades of marriage. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1917, surrounded by 3 generations of family. The house was packed with people, all of them there to honor the love story that had begun in a smoky saloon and blossomed into something enduring and beautiful. Rose gave a toast that made everyone cry, talking about her mother's strength and her father's devotion, about the example they had set for all of them about what real love looked like. "My mother taught me that scars do not define you," Rose said, her voice breaking slightly. "And my father taught me that real love sees past the surface to the person underneath." Together, they taught us all what it means to build a life based on respect and partnership and devotion. Hannah, her eyes wet with happy tears, squeezed Isaac's hand and whispered, "We did all right, did we not?" "Better than all right," Isaac whispered back. "We did beautiful." As they cut the anniversary cake, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Hannah thought about that scared girl hiding in a boarding house room, convinced that life had nothing more to offer her. If she could speak to that girl now, she would tell her to hold on, to be brave, to believe that happiness was possible even when it seemed impossibly far away. She would tell her about a cowboy with gray eyes and gentle hands, who would see past her scars to the woman she truly was, who would kiss her damaged hands and call her beautiful, and mean it with his whole heart. Who would give her a life more wonderful than she had ever dared to dream? And she would tell her that the scars, those marks that had once seemed like the end of everything, would eventually become just another part of her story, no more or less important than any other chapter. That healing was possible, that love was possible, that joy was possible even after the darkest of times. Isaac caught her eye across the crowded room and smiled, that same transforming smile that had first caught her attention all those years ago. Hannah smiled back, her whole heart in her eyes, and knew that every moment of pain and fear had been worth it to arrive at this perfect moment, surrounded by love and belonging, and the deep, abiding contentment of a life lived fully and without regret. As the party wound down and family members began to head home, Hannah and Isaac stood on the porch waving goodbye, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. The prairie stretched out before them in the gathering dusk, and Hannah breathed in the familiar scent of grass and earth and home. "Happy anniversary, my love," Isaac said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happy anniversary," Hannah replied, then held up her hands, still marked with those long-ago scars. "Thank you for always seeing me." Isaac took both her hands in his and kissed each one, his lips warm against her scarred skin. "Beautiful," he whispered, as he had done countless times before. "You are so beautiful, Hannah Dalton, and I am the luckiest man alive to call you mine." And Hannah, who had once hidden her hands in shame, who had thought herself unworthy of love and belonging, held tight to her husband and smiled, knowing with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, loved beyond measure by a man who had always seen her true worth. The stars came out one by one overhead as they stood there together, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. And if anyone had asked Hannah in that moment if she would change anything about her life, even the pain and the scars, she would have said no without hesitation. Because every step of her journey, every moment of fear and healing and growth had led her to this, to Isaac's arms and their family and a life filled with more love than she had ever thought possible. The scars on her hands were a part of her story, but they were not the whole story. They were simply the beginning of a tale of courage and resilience, and the transformative power of love that saw past the surface to the beautiful person underneath. And as Isaac led her back inside their little house, Hannah Dalton looked at her scarred hands in the lamplight and felt nothing but gratitude for everything they had allowed her to create, to hold, to build, and to love. She was whole, she was happy, and she was finally, truly home.